Hello, lovely listeners. This is Ela from Trust on Purpose. You have often heard Charles and I refer to the conversation before the conversation. And so we are going to release a snippet from our conversation before the conversation with Tom Geraghty from psychsafety.com. We really appreciated and dove right into a juicy conversation with him. And rather than keep that all to ourselves, we wanted to share some of this with you. The first episode, part one of the episode with Tom Geraghty, was released on September 30th, and part two will be released on the 14th of October. We hope you enjoy both of those episodes and this snippet into the behind the scenes. We so appreciate your continued support, your listening, your thoughts, your sharing, your communication, and we really hope that you enjoy this.
My name's Tom Geraghty. I'm the founder of a website called psychsafety.com. By original training, I was an ecologist, so my first degree was in ecology, and I sort of went into ecological research after that. And my first job title was experimentalist, which is still by a long way my coolest job title that I've ever had. So I kind of kept it. I identify as an experimentalist all the way through my career now. And you can see on my t-shirt, everything is an experiment. Yeah, that's one of our catchphrases, I think, at psychsafety.com. Yeah, so I started off as an ecologist and then moved into technology. And through that, started managing teams of software engineers, DevOps teams, started scaling up and became CIO and CTO of various firms. And it was that journey through sort of ecology and technology and managing teams and people and understanding the wider system of things that I became passionate about creating the conditions in which people can thrive. How do we create conditions in which people can do their best work? And that was what led me to psychological safety and what I do now.
Oh my gosh, so fascinating. And I love the title experimentalist.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right.
If we have that lens, like just everything is an experiment. And you're probably familiar with Amy Edmondson's new book.
Yes.
And that she's got a brilliant 7-minute video on this concept of intentional failing.
Yeah.
And there's a clip about, what's her name? Julia Child, back when she had the TV show,
Yes.
Whatever, in the 50s or 60s. And she flopped an omelet on live TV. And it's like, it's just an omelet.
Yeah.
Why do we get so fussed about oh my gosh, everything has to be perfect or right, or we've got to have it figured out?
Yeah. And this is exactly it, right? Because psychological safety and this understanding that we are imperfect human beings who are not going to be able to deliver and execute perfectly every single time, it's fundamentally part of the same dynamic, the same phenomenon. And this recognition, it's sort of the explicit conversation about running experiments, about how work and life, it should be primarily about the learning as an outcome rather than sort of delivering the thing, that it can completely change the way we approach work and life and the world, right? We, instead of being focused on execution, because of course that's kind of what we're taught a lot of the time through schools and things like that, isn't it? Instead focusing on what can we learn from this, it completely changes our perspective.
And yet, I think about, actually, I think I have a call with them today. So 3 members of a senior executive team, I've been working with their organization for a couple of years. They had a recent CEO change. So the VP has moved into the CEO role, and the CEO has moved to chair of the board. And they're terrified of making mistakes. Honestly,
Yeah.
terrified of making mistakes because what could happen? Well, but what could happen?
Exactly, right. Exactly. And often, so in our work, we find that often that comes because there hasn't been a discussion about what is safe to fail. There are some things in life that aren't safe to fail. We ideally we don't want anything to fail really, but there are some things that have a much higher cost of failure, right? And there are some things that have a very low cost of failure. But often in the world of work and in organizations, we don't have that conversation because there's so many leaders. You can imagine the sort of leader who is like, this mustn't fail. And it's a marketing campaign. Yeah, it's all right.
It's not life and death.
Yeah. And yet, again, I think our more traditional cultures, or if we look at the history of leadership and that do as I say, not as I do, and, nose up, ass down, get your work done, and no news is good news, to the, this is why I'm so interested about how you approach your feedback workshop is the days of the shit sandwich, where I'm going to say something insincere, some nicety, then I'm basically going to punch you in the gut. And then I'm going to say something also insincere to make it you should like this.
Yeah, to kind of make it the acceptable face of feedback. Yeah, 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 exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I think it's interesting that if and Amy reflects, I think, in the right kind of wrong, her new book, how there are industries and there are domains that are very, very high cost of failure, incredibly high cost of failure. You know, space
Aviation,
or
right?
aviation, right, right.
Aviation.
Yeah,
Right.
and if we're sending spaceships, rockets to the moon and stuff, the cost of failure is huge. It's in the millions each time, and potentially the cost of human lives. And yet, they have more discussions about failure, and they're more willing to embrace the cost and learning from failure in those organizations than in many organizations where you'd think this is just an iPhone app. Of course, this can fail. It doesn't, it doesn't matter. Yes, it would be nice if it was a wild success, but and it's interesting to see that dichotomy where sometimes the higher the price of failure, the more willing we are to address the learning from failure.
And I
Mhm.
wonder though if there's something about people's inability, I don't know, inability is the right word, but that the notion of learning has been lost. People aren't thinking about it as, oh, I can learn from this. I can learn from a failure. It's all about simply avoiding the failure. And maybe there's an underlying assumption that, learning, we're all at the top of our game. We can't learn anything new anyway. So let's not fail.
Yeah, 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 exactly. And also I think, I mean, you mentioned aviation a minute ago, and aviation has gone through this very painful journey of failure through much of the 20th century
Mhm.
and has learned through painful lessons that when things go wrong, and things do go wrong, we have to learn from it. We have to put in practices, techniques, behaviors, cultures, and beliefs that enable us to learn from this failure and prevent it or mitigate it happening in the future. And some of these less safety critical, less high cost of failure industries haven't had to go through those painful lessons, and so they haven't been learned.
Yeah, that's so fat. Like I'm thinking of, okay, so another client that I work with is in higher education. There are painfully very apparent things that are absolutely not working.
Yeah,
And this is interesting because it's just coming into my mind. As a higher ed institution, well, of course, we're very smart. We know what we're doing.
yeah,
And yet their openness to risk and fail is there's zero tolerance, right? Because there's this persona or this facade about we know how to do everything. We're a higher ed institution. Of
yeah,
course, we're
yeah,
not going to fail. But what would
yeah.
be possible if they gave themselves permission and actually intentionally designed a failure?
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring in higher ed and academia and stuff because so we work a fair bit with a number of sort of higher educational academic institutions, and almost entirely there are some very difficult, problematic, risk averse, and unpsychologically safe cultures in those organizations, and it's somewhat embedded within the academic domain. It's because
Mhm.
we defend our PhDs, we defend stuff, and it's very adversarial. And if there's a weakness, then we exploit it and we attack other people's research and we try to pick holes in everything. And so, of course, everything becomes very defensive, and we don't want to expose our mistakes or flaws or vulnerabilities because inherently we feel they'll be exploited. And so that doesn't lead to that sort of quite progressive, generative sort of culture. It leads to something else.
Yeah. And yet you think about it. So there's this lack of trust in oneself and what one can do through learning. So rather than saying, hey, poke holes in my theory, poke holes in my research, really question it. I want to learn from that. I want to understand it. It's, as you say, Tom, much more about defending it and not acknowledging even to myself that there are any flaws, possible flaws in whatever it is that I'm doing.
Mm. We talk about the different kinds of trust, don't we? And I think in these sorts of environments, in these sorts of domains, there is high cognitive trust. We trust generally that people are very, very competent at what they do. They're smart people. Like you just said, Charles, they've got PhDs. So they're smart people. They know what they're doing. But we don't necessarily trust that other people have our best interests at heart. We can't trust that they won't use something against us if they find out a flaw or vulnerability or weakness. So that's where these different kinds of trust sort of
Mhm.
diverge.
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
Ooh, we're gonna have such a good conversation. I love this.
Yeah.
I love this.
Yes. Well, so speaking of the conversation,
Should we shift
yeah,
into like let's
yeah, let's.
actually start?
Yeah, now that we know that Tom is an experimentalist, which fantastic. That's a great place to start is that whole conversation about experimenting and failing and learning and all that kind of.
Well, and I think talking about the intersection and how trust and psychological safety, how they intersect, the differences, the importances of, but like it has been on our radar to talk about probably since the very beginning.
One of the questions that I get most often from people
all
is,
the time.
help me understand the difference between trust and psychological safety. So this is
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of you, Charles, and please chime in if you have a different or a plus also. We're really looking for, and I think you came across our path. I don't believe in coincidence in a way that we can really talk about this. That's not, I don't want to, this doesn't sound right. Overly academic. Like, let's talk about this like humans.
Yeah.
Let's make this practical, relatable, everyday stuff that we all bump into. And I think you're the perfect one to have this conversation with. So yeah, we're really excited that you're here.
I'm really excited to be here. And I really like that approach because we at psychsafety.com and I guess I've always prided myself. We certainly identify and pride ourselves on the fact that we are practitioners. I appreciate and I love getting geeky and nerdy about theory and research and diving into that. But fundamentally, we're practitioners. We do this work. We do the work.
Yeah.
We're in organizations. We're doing this with people, with human beings. And so that's the kind of approach we take. And fundamentally as practitioners of this stuff.
Yeah. Boots on the ground. Let's
Yeah.
bump into the same stuff that everyone else does because we're all human.
Yeah.
We're all human.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to diving into this episode. Tom, thank you so much for what you've shared so far. And listeners, please tune in as we continue our conversation with Tom Geraghty.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
On behalf of both Charles and myself, we want to say a big thank you to our producer and sound editor, Chad Penner, Hillary Rideout of Inside Out Branding, who does our promotion, our amazing graphics, and marketing for us. And our theme music was composed by Jonas Smith. If you have any questions or comments for us about the podcast, if you have a trust-related situation that you'd like us to take up in one of our episodes, we'd love to hear from you at trust@trustonpurpose.org.
And we'd also like to thank you, our listeners. Take care and keep building trust on purpose. Until next time.
Until next time.